Hello and welcome to the Gunboat Long Patrol. Now, I'm going to start this off with a little bit of an announcement, although I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but there have now been 200 votes cast for patron. Joint first place at the moment, running at the top, is Michael66. If Tsingtao incident leads to war, how does 1939 RN carrier force fare against 1939 IJN force with 20 votes? And Martin Peacock's the Queen Elizabeth class, a brave first step, a faltering giant leap, or something else, possibly a secret successful failure, on 20 votes. Interestingly enough, in third place on 15 votes is Paul Thompson's The Attack on Copenhagen in 1801 and following Operation Danish Waters until the fall of Napoleon. And then in joint third place is Colin Cameron's HMS Vanguard sinks ARA Vincent de Meer in 1982. How does it affect the US and Soviet naval development, if at all? 14 votes. And Wayne Boren's HMS Argical, as proposed by Alex, is built. How do other navies react? Now again, there are more votes yet to be cast. There are people who have still not voted. I can tell this because of the number of votes total cast. There are 200 votes being cast. And everyone's allowed to do multiple choice. So usually I'm not sure how many you pick, but you know, I know how many patrons I have, and I divide that by thinking if the minimum if I was voting, I'd probably vote for about 5 of them. There's about 5 of them I'd go, I'd quite like any of those 5. So I would go, in fact there's not one I really wouldn't like, but if I was sort of thinking, well, I can't vote for all of them because that's kind of a wasted vote, so what would I vote for? I'd probably pick a top 5. So I usually estimate people would probably be voting for about 3 or 4. So I times my number of patrons by about 3 or 4, and I think, well, that's about the number of votes which I'd be expecting to see if everyone votes. And we're currently at about half that. So I have strong suspicions there are more votes to be cast. So if you want to go vote, if you're a patron, please do. And once again, I will explain sort of the patron system is very simple as I run it on my channel. What happens is patrons get to make suggestions of topics, and then I go through the topics, and I check them for viability for me to do them within the time allowed. So if it's a massive topic, I go, sorry, no. There is a limit to what I can do in about a week, sort of fitting around my regular teaching and my other stuff. Sorry. Capability of me to do it from an actual knowledge-based perspective. I can actually do it and add to it something interesting. So if you were asking me about a long question about torpedo tube design, I'd probably sit there and go, no. Yeah, I'm sure there is a historian somewhere who has specialised in torpedo tube design, but I haven't found their book yet, so I can't even go from that. And I teach history of engineering. I'm not an engineer. There is a limit to my knowledge, and at certain points, my torpedo tube design is basically going to run through a lot of me going through the various processes of how they get the torpedo loaded into the tube and how they get the torpedo to leave the tube. And there are a couple of different systems, but I think that's probably my knowledge will fit within about 6 slides. And as a rule, I'm looking for producing 12 to 15 slides. So that's what I usually sort of think about. And the final thing, which sort of happens, is they need to be adapted because they go into the public vote. And by adaptation, I mean the public vote has a certain caption limit. It has a caption limit, and I put the name of the patron who has put it forward because it's important to me that you get credit. It's always important to me that the patron, or in some of them which are the public vote ones, the public comments where I've taken someone's suggestion of a topic for what I call the viewer videos, which I have about 5 a year. Sometimes they're live, sometimes, well, there's about, actually there could be more, there's about, potentially about 10 a year, including lives and long patrols, which I sort of just the Tuesday videos. Where if I see someone's topic suggestion in a comment and they're not a subscriber, well, they might be a subscriber, might be just a viewer, but they're not a patron, as a rule. And I go, I like that. Now, the trouble is, sometimes I do pick them up and I then put them in, and then they become patrons, and then that sounds like I'm picking a patron's suggestion again. And I was looking, well, when I picked them and I programmed it in, scheduled in, they weren't. I went and checked the patron list. It didn't. There was no name which corresponded with their YouTube handle. That's the other fun thing that happens to me. But within the ability of due diligence I try to make sure there's a differential. And there's about 10 of those a year. But what happens is I put them into the system, so people get their credit, and they always get their credit. It's always written on the front of the slides. If you look at any of the Patreon videos, down this bit where I've got a sort of subtitle, there's usually a name if there is a suggested by someone else. And from there, they have to go in, fit in the character limit, and then they get voted for. And the two which get the most votes get done. So it's not the most vote. It's not a first past the post system purely. It's the top two. And occasionally, when there is a tie for second place, I have been known to do 3, and I'm able to fit it in. I have been known to do 3. But that's occasionally. I prefer to do 2, because I prefer to keep it even-handed, because otherwise it then becomes a case of, if you do that too often, why don't you just do the top 3? Because you're doing the top 3 anyway. At which point, you have to start rethinking sort of things and organising. And also there's the fact, this is going to sound strange, with the where I divide the week and the month up, by having 2, I plan out and know what I'm going to do a long time in advance before the vote. I can have that research done 2-3 months beforehand. If I've got a down period, I can have that all worked out and all the slides and everything done up 2-3 months in advance. Boom, done. And so I've kind of got that in the bank. And then I just need to record it closer to the time, make sure it's as up to date with the information available as I possibly can when I record it. Whereas the patron suggestions, they are very much a case of, I try to get the patron suggestions open in the second week of the month, and I try and get the patron vote the patron suggestions open in the third week of the month, the patron vote in the fourth week of the month, or the first week of the month, depending on the timing of things and how things are going, so that they have come in, and then I have about a week to prep them. And it works out, but it's limited. Anyway, gunboats. Yes, gunboats. And I just realised there is a fox in distress behind me. Actually, that's not the only fluffy creature in distress behind me. There is a lion also in distress. So we'll put the lion there as well, behind the fox. So there is a lion sitting behind a fox. In real life, that could be very, very problematic for the fox, but on my fleece, it's probably safe. Gunboats. Well, the moment I get gunboats out, as a rule, I get strong suggestions that I turn to this book. James Cable's Gunboat Diplomacy, 1919, to 1979. And one of the interesting things is it has in its back all the incidents which happened in that period. It has an index of incidents and of events that took place. It's worth reading. It's, what can I say? It's kind of illuminating, the various incidents, especially once you get into the more modern period. But if you go back to the early ones, to let's say, 1920, 14th of May, United States, Mexico. Bandits in charge of Manzanillo since 11 a.m. 14th. Destroyer Thornton, Commander Sterling arrived 4 p.m. and saved town from violence. Standing by. 18th of May, Soviet Union, assailant, Soviet Union, victim, Iran, Britain. Bolshevik destroyer and coastal motorboats seize White Russian ships in Enzeli harbour, bombard and occupy town, and expel small British contingent. Although the subsequent creation of a Red Revolutionary Committee of Persia proved an ephemeral achievement, the continued occupation of Enzeli, Resht, and other parts of the province of Gilan gave the Soviet Union a bargaining counter, which, after the seizure of the Persian throne by Rez Khan on 21st of February 1921, resulted in the signature of an advantageous Russo-Persian treaty and the reputation by Persia of the earlier Anglo-Persian agreement. Partially successful. Wonder why it would be partially successful. 17th of November. Britain on Greece. After the electoral defeat of the pro-British Greek Prime Minister Venizelos, he leaves the country hurriedly on a yacht, which was escorted by HMS Centaur to prevent any attempt by a new Greek government to arrest Venizelos. Successful. Notes. British naval activities continued in the Baltic and elsewhere. There were numerous instances of use of limited naval force against the Bolsheviks. Mostly demonstrations. 29th February to the 19th of March. Assailant, Britain. Victim, Soviet Union. 1921. British warships evacuate British subjects and sympathisers from Baton before this capital of the ephemeral state of Georgia falls to the Bolsheviks. Successful. 5th of August. United States, China. The United States Navy established a Yangtze River Patrol to protect U.S. interests, lives and property, and to maintain and improve friendly relations with the Chinese people. The success achieved in the first objective was more conspicuous than in the second. 18th of August, United States, Panama. 400 United States Marines embarked by USS Pennsylvania to induce Panama to conform to American decision regarding her border dispute with Costa Rica. Successful. 1st of November, Britain, Austria-Hungary. HMS as the victim. HMS Glowworm and other British ships on the Danube flotilla collected the ex-emperor Karl of Austria-Hungary from Baja in Hungary after the failure of his attempt to gain the throne and convey him to Romania, whence HMS Cardiff takes him to Madeira. This intervention by the Royal Navy was approved by the principal European governments, and the use of naval force was necessary only to prevent the ex-emperor from being rescued by his partisans or kidnapped by his opponents while on his way to exile. 14th of August, assailant, this is 1922, Britain, victim China. President Sun Yat-sen rescued from Canton after his defeat by Chinese rebels and taken to Shanghai in British gunboat. Successful. I can carry on. The fact is, gunboat diplomacy is often carried out by ships which aren't gunboats. So that is the first thing you have to start racking your brain around once you start discussing gunboats. That not all gunboats are gunboats. Some are sloops. Some are cruisers and destroyers, and battleships even can be used for gunboat diplomacy. Basically, gunboat diplomacy is when you turn up with a vessel and you go, now you are going to do what we ask you to, or, well, you notice how this ship happens to be a floating arsenal and sovereign territory of ours. That's not a good scenario for you to fight. It's not necessarily a good scenario for me to wage war in either, but it's not a good scenario for you to fight. Well, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. One of the problems comes when you realise that there are some places which are very, very difficult to get to. And so, even by ships, you need to get to them. And usually what makes a place difficult to get to by a ship is it's either completely inland, in which case there is no way probably to get there, or it is only approachable through very shallow water. And this is an age where you do not have helicopters. or ramped landing craft that can deploy tanks. And all the other accoutrements which allow you to move personnel around rapidly around someone's territory. So, what do you think? Well, actually, here's the interesting thing. Most large cities tend to be on fairly decent-sized rivers. They have to be. They need both a source of drinking water. They also need a source of sewage movement. And finally, they need a trading point to justify their existence, because often cities have grown up as centres of commerce and trade. London is a good example. It was a port. It was not just the capital city, it was a port. It was where the tide stabilised enough, you could cross the Thames, so you could go either north or south, and you could bring in all the trade up there, and it was a good position to reach all the lands around it. So, Brighton. If you want to influence events then further inland, what you probably need is a shallow draft vessel with a big gun on it. Hence, gun boat. Think of them as your tank, artillery, APC, helicopter thrown into one great big boat. That's pretty much what they are. Mobile command post, mobile sovereign territory, mobile status symbol, mobile direct fire and indirect fire, because they often carry mortars as well as direct fire weapons. Just to be extra fun, isn't it fun? Yeah, you think, you know what? Yeah, we can't see them, so they can't do any damage to us. Doo, boom. They've got a mortar. Yep. Who said they were allowed a mortar? Well, you know, no one told them they couldn't. And I don't think they should have a mortar. Well, they've got one. So you can go and have that conversation with them, but I doubt they'll listen. Now, famously, of course, you have the insect and fly gunboats, which are originally built in World War I. This was, of course, an insect up there a second ago. Which were built primarily with the idea of supporting British troops in the littorals. The other name for gunboat would be a littoral combat ship, because they specialise in fighting in the littorals. But also, they go with full brown water navy, up rivers, happily. And they famously take part in the campaign in Iraq. And are friggin' crucial, because without them, you don't move the supplies. There's the army moving along either side of the river, and the fire support and supplies is coming up on the gunboats. And the gunboats often range ahead of the troops, because they can move a lot quicker. And so you have reconnaissance by gunboat, which also often involves fire by gunboat. And eventually they even have a scenario where sometimes the gunboats are towing barges with troops on them. And what happens is they spot the enemy, the gunboat starts firing, they let loose the barge after angling it, so the barge goes into the bank, the gunboat continues on firing, the troops get out of the barge onto the shore, do an attack while the gunboat's still firing and getting closer and closer to the enemy position, and yeah, that's basically all she wrote. They're there. So that's a gunboat's capability. Now, this, of course, beautiful example of a river gunboat, and these are even more specialised in many ways, is the USS Panay, which of course was part of the Yangtze Patrol, which, as you heard, was established during the interwar period. And Panay is one of those boats which is pretty uncritical to US efforts there, but of course is sunk by the Japanese. And this leads us to another point. She sunk in 12th December 1937. Think about that. one of the things that's often forgotten is the sheer number of events which, if handled differently, could have led to war in the 1930s in the Far East, before World War II began in Germany. This is with Germany, and it's the sort of thing. This is one of the things which people I come up against a lot as a historian. They go, "Oh, Britain wasn't investing enough in this, this, and this, and they weren't focusing on Europe because the threat was Germany." And you go, "Yeah." You see, in Germany, you have a lot of hot words and rhetoric flying around, and yes, they're building an army, but, nicest way, it's a lot of hot words and rhetoric. In the Far East, they're actually shooting at each other. You can understand someone concentrating on the latter rather than the former. Hot words may or may not lead to shooting at each other. Actually shooting at each other is already there. Pointing guns at each other. Again, this is one of those interesting things. If you look at the relationship between Britain, America, and Japan in the late 1930s, and you compare it to the relationship between Britain and Germany prior to World War One, or Britain and Germany prior to World War II, and Britain and Italy prior to World War II, it's completely different. It's far, far more hostile. It's far, far more aggressive. It's really not a nice scenario to be in. I've already talked about the Tsingtao incident a number of times. I've done videos on that. And that's January 1939. You can go back and you can find earlier incidents which are just as fraught, often involving American and British gunboats. And one interesting thing is, this is in the 1920s and 1930s. The events going on in China forge a very close relationship between Britain and America, especially on the naval level. These patrols pretty much act as two sides of the same coin. When the Panay incident happens, the first vessels to arrive on the scene are two British gunboats. They arrive, and there is no hesitation. They hear an American gunboat has been attacked. The Japanese are still operating in this area, still attacking ships. They've sunk the Panay. The British come straight in, because it's an American gunboat in trouble, and that's their friends. I'd say that one of the interesting discussions that have happened recently, of course, I did that video about the different options with with building carriers of the Lexingtons, and if you wanted to complete all six, half as the question started as half. If you're completing half of the Lexingtons as battlecruisers and half as aircraft carriers, what would you do? And that's led to some really interesting discussions. But one of the most interesting that I have to admit has come out, and when I say interesting, it shows me some of the misunderstandings that go way about the world at this time. And one of the things that comes up, I think, time and time again, is people, in terms of history, don't really understand what exactly happens. One of the points that comes here is a rather interesting one, because 1968-3-1 responded to discussion going on. I'm taking this out of context to an extent, but it's very. We're talking. He said, "Strange how no one considers that the US decides to turn all six Lexington-class battlecruisers into aircraft carriers." Well, of course they could, but for that you'd have to justify building aircraft carriers. But his other point, he then goes on, and I say, well, that's because it doesn't make sense in that environment. And then he goes on, well, the Americans decide we want six and tell the British we don't care what you say because we control your debt and can bankrupt you in an arms race if you try to raise a sink about it. The Americans don't control debt like that. That's one of the things that's often sort of misunderstood about sort of debt, etc. And in the 1920s, it's not that way. But also, if the Americans had decided to build six, then that's outside the treaty. So there's no longer a treaty negotiation going on. So in which case, the admirals wouldn't have been completed. They'd have been got rid of, probably, by the British, and the British would have built the G3s. And then you could say America could turn around and go, "We will bankrupt." We could turn around and go, "Yes, we if you don't, we'll call in a debt." Okay, so you will act against the clauses of the debt. That's fine if you want to do that, but there's a then consequence for the Americans, because if you base that in the world scenario today, where America is the linchpin of the global economy, that is fine. American can do that. No one after that will then trust them with their debt ever again, which will cause all sorts of problems. But we'll leave that to one side. They can do that. You can it's going to sound strange. You can get away with doing that to a small nation sometimes, but if you do that to a bigger nation, it's going to cause trouble in the international community. But the reason I'm talking about that in the context of this and River Gunboats is because the world at this point, London is the financial hub of the world. Yes, New York is growing up, and America is growing as financial. London is the financial hub of the world. If you undermine the British economy to that extent, and the Americans realise this, then the global economy will break down. And also, there is the small problem that whilst America does have a large chunk of British debt, they don't have all of it by a long way. And Britain has other means of raising capital, potentially to pay off that debt. That includes Canada, Australia, South Africa, India. The British Raj can buy a lot of debt of Britain's and all these things, and that's one of your problems. You can pull that lever, but the end result will be you have a very annoyed Britain, you have a global system which doesn't trust you, and you're in more trouble than they are. Because there's always the other option that Britain just says, we'll default and not pay, because you are acting out of good conscience. And how do you compel them then? Well, you compel Greece by sending gunboat diplomacy over there. But you've just acted that and literally gone, we want to sort of stop you having a navy, so we're doing this. Which side is France going to pick in that scenario? Which side will Germany pick? The Empire? All those places you are building up good relations with and getting good credit. Now, for them to turn again, so that this is one of the things. Relationships are not one-sided. There are two-sided relationships going on. And that goes back to, again, the Yangtze Patrol being set up. Because the Americans set up the Yangtze Patrol and are assisted in doing so by the British. The British help them. There is a two-way street relationship going on here. When Britain makes the value judgment about dropping the Anglo-Japanese alliance, that is because of the work of the Pilgrim Society and other organisations that they've decided they've actually got a stronger relationship with the Americans. This is the reasoning going on in Britain. And if America had turned around and then decided to, over that, well, they could, but then the under those circumstances, the Washington Treaty doesn't happen. Because if America turns around to the Washington Treaty and goes, all right, and everyone signed this, right, and we're still building 6 Lexingtons and nothing any of you can do about it, they've just broken the treaty. It's bad enough they didn't join the League of Nations, they then which they thought they wanted to be set up and was a key part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. But they then broke their own treaty. Who's going to trust America after that? Who's going to trust them? No one is. And then if they then turn around and go, oh, we're going to call in the British debt at the same time. So they've broken their own debt rules, they've not joined the League of Nations, and they've just broken a treaty which they brokered. What happens to America in that scenario? Because we think about America as this great continent which can grow up in itself and all sorts of things, but actually it's part of an interconnected system and has been for a long time. Has a lot of interconnected trade going on. If things break down in those circumstances, they then have to go alone. And I'm not talking about the isolationism that they have on that, but lots of other issues as well. Like, for example, whilst in this period of supposed isolationism, when they don't join the League of Nations, you have this great cooperation going on between their river gunboats and the British river gunboats in the Yangtze River, where when one gets into trouble, the others turn up. So sometimes it's a British gunboat which gets into trouble and the Americans come steaming in just as hard. Or it's an American gunboat which gets in trouble. Panay incident, but there are others as well. And the British come in just as fast. Doesn't matter. Whoever's closest goes. Neither one has enough gunboats to always be present everywhere on the river. It's based on a system of cooperation. And a lot of those scenarios which you put forward there are based on, America deciding to bankrupt Britain, or deciding to not call them that, maybe just to challenge Britain to a naval race. And Congress would, of course, fund that. But there again, the naval race for Britain and America is different than the naval race to Germany. So unless, yes, America could go for a numbers naval race. But the trouble is, at that point, then they're probably going to have to be countering in numbers of not just Britain, but Japan, and all the other nations who Britain will arraign, because of what they will have done. Imagine if, instead of pushing through the Treaty of Versailles, Britain turns around to France and goes, right, well, America's building battleships like anything and challenging everyone, and they're upstating the status quo. We need Germany back with a navy. Germany's not allowed an army anymore, but they're allowed to have a navy, because we need their fleet to back our fleet up. And oh, by the way, we need you to be building a fleet, and we need the Italian fleet. And there's no treaty because in a nice way, America herself has just disavowed her own treaty, so the Washington Treaty has collapsed. America has a lot of construction capability, but they have to do other things as well. And then you've got the cost rise. At that point, would Congress keep going on for it? No. And that works against American interests. All that would work against American interests. And the Americans are very smart and canny diplomatic operators. So they know that. And they know how the systems work. And it's better. One of the reasons why you have this sort of Anglophone system rather than a British system and then an American system come in, and where America sort of takes the lead of the British built system, is because of the way the Americans very quickly noticed that when you have massive changeovers, and you've had the systems change over from between big powers, usually A, you have a war, and B, more often than not, you have a period of intense economic slump and problems all around the world because of the changes to the systems. What the British do, and to an extent the Americans, what the Americans do and the British do, and to an extent also a participant of, is a sort of handing over, rather than necessarily a whoosh. And that is, to an extent, intentional, unintentional, unguided. There's all sorts of different options for why it happens and how it happens. And there are issues certainly at the end of it. But that creates the basis for what comes. And that starts off with the relationship building that's been going on since about the 1890s, but with the cooperation which begins in the 1920s. And that is chosen by both sides. And that is part of the gunboat diplomacy going on here. That is part of what's going on with the river gunboats. And the Panay incident is an interesting incident, but I will say that I've never quite believed the pilots can make mistakes as well, again, and you do have problems of identification from the air, but mistaking the Chinese flag at the time for the American flag, that's a big one. That is really a big one. And then come to all this, we have the Dragonfly class gunboat. Now, the Dragonfly class started construction in 1937. are completed. Dragonfly and Grasshopper in June 1939. Scorpion in November 1938. She's an upgunned variant of the class, but she's actually completed before Dragonfly and Grasshopper, which are theoretically the first two of the class laid down. Then comes Locust and Mosquito, which are completed in 1940. Mosquito has literally only been completed in April 1940 and is lost off Dunkirk on the 1st of June 1940. Very, very good book about Dunkirk. This is one of those Britannia Naval Histories of World War II series books. Now, these ships were built because, believe it or not, again, there were issues going on in Japan and the Far East and China. And so the Royal Navy was needing to upgrade its presence capability. But they are not armoured warfighting vessels. They really aren't. Let's be honest, they displace 594 tons. They have two 4-inch guns on 40-degree mounts, which means they're not high angle at all. Hello. One 3.7-inch mortar, Mark V howitzer, not mortar. And 8 machine guns. Yeah, some of the earlier ones had mortars, these ones had a howitzer. You know. Hello. You always think... I have been joined by the assistant fluffy research assistant, and he has decided that the back of his head is cuter than my face. It's accurate, but still hurtful. So, Mosquito, she's lost at Dunkirk, and she actually had a quadruple 2-pounder pom-pom fitted instead of the howitzer. The idea was to give her better air defence for what she was going to be doing, because they thought she was going to be used for inshore work to help out in European waters by the time she's completed. Now, if we turn to this book, hello. 4th air attack, 12:30 hours, sinking on a Mosquito. Among the vessels which went to the assistance of Scotia was the gunboat Mosquito, though she never reached her. The Mosquito arrived off Dunkirk from the Downs at about 12:30 hours. She was attacked on the way over by a single dive bomber and was damaged by a near miss, but was able to continue on her course. Off Dunkirk, she embarked some 30 French and Belgian troops from the motorboat Rapide. Hearing that the Scotia was reported to be sinking at the west end of the channel, she proceeded towards the scene, followed by the Rapide. Almost immediately, 6 or more of a flight of 20 Ju-87s attacked her from different directions, obtaining a direct hit and a near miss. With boiler and engine rooms badly holed, the steering gear jammed with the rudder hard over, the ship took a heavy lift to port. The crew of the pom-pom were all killed or knocked out except acting leading seaman Ronald Thirlwall, who, although shockingly badly wounded in at least 4 places, kept the one undamaged barrel firing until ammunition was exhausted. The .5-inch gun aft was also kept in action by able seaman CAL Hirschfeld, who went aft and brought the gun into action single-handedly after all crew were wounded. With water pouring into the ship, the Mosquito was abandoned, the survivors being picked up by the Rapide and 2 drifters. Among the killed was the executive officer, Lieutenant A.H. Mainwaring. Mainwaring. Royal Navy. Think about that. This is a vessel which can do 17 knots at top speed. Not exactly fast. It's got a draft of 1.5 meters, beam of 10 meters, and length of 60 meters. She was evacuating people from Dunkirk. HMS B was never completed. Only one vessel survives World War II, that's HMS Locust. which is later refitted with 3 20mm guns and 20 depth charges, as well as having a quadruple pom-pom fitted instead of the 3.7-inch howitzer. She enters service in May 1940 and also takes part in operations off Dunkirk. The remaining 3, they're lost in the Far East. 2 on Valentine's Day 1942 and 1 on the 13th of February 1942. Now, there are various details and sources I've used here, and there should be links below you'll find to navalhistory.org Australia, which will have the naval evacuation of Singapore, February 1942, and HMS Scorpion's own page on uboat.net. All have some excellent details about her, and that quote is taken from the Naval History evacuation of Singapore. I would say I'm not sure I quite agree with some of the discursive points in that paper. It's a very good paper and a very well written paper, but again, I'm a historian and therefore it's written by another historian, so the odds are I won't agree with everything. I think to an extent the tone to me suggests they're ascribing almost, not, I wouldn't like to say malice, but an uncaring attitude to the Australians, because they do make a point of referencing how the Australians don't get enough spaces for their proportion of personnel in the evacuation fleet. Well, A, the evacuation fleet seems to be pretty darn badly organised. B, it's depending on ships which should never be doing it to do it. And C, the whole thing of Singapore is pretty badly organised. Let's be honest. If they had defended the reservoir, which had positions, pre-built positions put there to help with its defence, if they had put a company, let alone a battalion, which they were supposed to, at the reservoir, the odds are the Japanese wouldn't have taken the reservoir. If they hadn't taken the reservoir, the defenders of Singapore wouldn't have run out of water. The defenders of Singapore hadn't run out of water. They had plenty of supplies. They could have carried on. And the Japanese would have run out of food probably within 24 hours. In which case, okay, it's 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, broadly speaking, is what we tend to ascribe to things. But in terms of being combat viable, it's not 3 weeks. In fact, it's a lot quicker than that in terms of being combat viable. No, you're not getting off to go jumping around the floor. I know you've got plans. So, that is a problem for them. That is definitely a problem. If the Japanese run out of supplies, and they would have done, would they have been forced to withdraw? Possibly back off the Singapore island itself from lack of supplies, or they might have carried on fighting and then fallen apart. Either way, the whole Malay defence, etc., as I've discussed in other videos, is an absolute cluster. Absolute cluster. Cluster frigate. Definitely cluster frigate. Absolute cluster frigate. Now, this is a description of the end of these ships. So the Locust class river gunboats, again, the author calls them the Locust class, they were the Dragonfly class. I'm not sure why they picked Locust class. She's the only one that survives the war, so that makes sense on that front. But Dragonfly and Grasshopper were both laid down in December 1937, and Scorpion was a sub-variant, which was supposed to be upgunned. I'm not quite sure I agree with the whole idea of Scorpion having been upgunned. She doesn't seem to have much more in the way of firepower than the others do. But there again, perhaps this is all relative, being upgunned into this scenario. Oh. No. Anyway, Locust-class river gunboats were relatively new steam turbine ships of 585 tons, capable of 17 knots. I would say that they were capable of 17 knots. They were designed to shallow draft for river work and going up and down the Yangtze River. They weren't designed for open ocean. So 17 knots in a river and in the more relative wave movement and effects of a river is different from being able to do 17 knots at sea. They carried 2 4-inch guns, 1 3.7-inch gun, and 8 machine guns. Again, I would point out the 4-inch guns are not AA weapons, and the 3.7-inch gun is not an AA weapon. A howitzer is not something you're going to engage an aircraft with, and guns which can only go up to 40 degrees are, again, not going to be much use against aircraft. You can try at range, but then you really need radar and to be a bit bigger to be able to spot them, and you also probably need to be a better gun platform for open ocean. So basically they're machine guns. With a crew of 75 officers and men, Scorpion made her escape on 9th of February and suffered air attacks, but was able to continue until encountering the Japanese cruiser Yura and 2 destroyers when she was sunk. She did try and fight back. Of the few survivors, 8 were picked up by the Japanese, and later 6 more were found by the steamer Matahari. Always nice to know that Matahari is still helping out the Allies. Very useful agent, Matahari. Dragonfly and Grasshopper sailed in company on the 13th of February with about 325 troops bound for Sumatra. Both ships were attacked by aircraft in the Banker Strait, with Dragonfly hit 3 times, sinking quickly. Grasshopper was hit twice and set on fire, but her captain managed to beach her on nearby Sabah Islands. There was considerable loss of life and casualties from both vessels, and most survivors were captured. They should never have been there. But also, this again, it's going to sound strange, but I have often viewed there is a big problem in the run-up to World War II, and that is the lack of the construction of sloops. And I'll get into that in a second, but I'm just going to put someone down so he doesn't break his paws jumping. There is an issue, and it's quite a strong issue with what was going on in the Far East, etc., that the British government really hasn't been investing enough in defence. And one of the key issues they hadn't been investing in was the fact that... Sorry, just pouring myself a drink. Was sloops. Was small ships covered by Article 8 of the London Naval Treaty, and various other treaties as well have various forms similar to them, which allow for vessels under 2,000 tons, under 20 knots, not carrying over a certain number of guns, in top of design speed, etc. 20 knots design speed. You could build as many as you liked. Not having them is a problem. Not having them is the reason you have to have gunboats doing evacuations here, rather than sloops, which tend to be far more ocean-capable vessels. They are also vessels which are used for anti-submarine warfare, all sorts of things. And if you think about it, instead of doing a sort of half-hearted program, which the British do in the 1920s and 30s, where they test out what they need for a small escort by building sloops, and then use that information to mass-produce corvettes when they order the Flower class. If instead they'd been building sloops, which were not the most expensive vessels in the world, in fact, blooming cheap, they'd have grown turbine capacity, because they were turbine powered, which would have helped when you're... Because if you're... It's going to sound strange. If you are building up for war construction from this level, it's a lot more difficult to get to here, what you might need for wartime, than if you're building up from this level. So if you've got more construction going on, it's far easier to get to there. But if you're going from down here, then that's a far bigger jump in terms of capacity. And that's their problem. They haven't been investing in the right things. And again, sloops could have been being built, and they could have been in service, and they could have been available for anti-submarine warfare, and then we might not have lost Royal Oak, we might not have lost aircraft carriers. There's at least 2 which lost the submarines, which, with if you'd had more escorts around, could have been helpful. Because again, if you have more sloops available, you need less destroyers to cover things like convoys, in which case you have more destroyers to do the work with carrier battle groups and to do that sort of anti-submarine hunting. And you probably had the sloops doing submarine hunting as it is. You know, more sloops around means you might have a patrol sitting around Gibraltar, which is far stronger as a patrol around Scapa Flow, where of course Royal Oak is lost, etc., which could prevent battleships, carriers, etc., which were lost, being lost, which would mean cumulatively Britain would probably have more force at certain points, which means they might have more force available when it comes to the Far East, because ultimately the reason all these ships are sunk, etc., is because of, well, A, the lack of investment in sloops, but also war starts off in Germany, then Italy joins the war, and there are losses, and those factors combined means that eventually when it comes to it, Britain doesn't have the forces available to do the Far East plan. And the forces in the Far East are not worked up. They're not the ones which were out there prior to World War II, because those would have worked up hardcore parts of the British forces. Because, again, Japan was a likely threat. Which is one of the reasons why the Far East, their good troops and personnel trapped out in the Far East do frigating well. There's the classic story of the HMS Abraham Christensen, which is a Jan van Amstel class minesweeper, which basically pretends to be an island to escape the Japanese. It was out there doing minesweeper duties and being used as a gunboat on occasions in the Dutch East Indies. It was a presence vessel, and it was doing its presence very well. And then, to get back, it does it this way. The fact that it works is frigging amazing. And yeah, it then arrives in Australia and gets fitted with ASDIC equipment and commissioned officially in the Royal Australian Navy as an anti-submarine escort, but its Dutch sailors are actually supplemented with sailors from the British destroyer HMS Jupiter, which have been sunk, as well as some Australian personnel, all under the command of an Australian lieutenant. What they did was they also came up with a very diplomatic way of a way of getting around things, and this shows you how nations can cooperate. And that it was decided to leave Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands on the bulkhead in the wardroom, and they hung King George VI in the lieutenant's cabin, which must have made the lieutenant ever so happy. Oh, I'm just dozing. Wake up. Oh, the king is staring at me, and I'm in my pyjamas. Oh, no, it's a dream. It's not a dream, it is. It's just a painting. Oh, good lord. Anyway. They had withdrawn to Australia with personnel aboard and everything to get away by making themselves look like an island. And the fact this works is cool. Any hull which was exposed was painted to resemble rocks and cliff, and the ship remained close to shore, anchored and immobile during daylight, only moving at night. But again, we sit down and go, so this is some real thought going through it. Okay, you have gunboats. I would say a minesweeper is closer to a sloop, especially as most of the British, in case the sloops were sloops were also used as minesweepers. Gunboat, not a seagoing vessel. If you look at that class, they are lovely looking, but they're not exactly fast. Again, the Abraham Christensen is only capable of 15 knots, if you've been actually doing a proper, sensible, organised evacuation, A, sailing at night would be sensible. B, doing something to disguise your vessels would be sensible. C, I'm not sure I would be heading south. Because south looks like heading straight into the war zone. I might try and skirt round the other side of a certain of islands. I might try and go to India rather than to Australia. And I'd have said going up the coast would possibly have been sensible, and only moving at night again, all these things, and it's just not thought through. And that's on everyone involved. It is on everyone involved. The fact is, the whole of Singapore is reacting out of panic for the British. Because they're falling apart. And they're falling apart because the people who've come in have not taken a realistic... how do I put this? There are lots of options of which they could have done, and one of the first ones would have been, okay, we need to abandon something and shorten our defensive lines, because penny packets strewn out all over the places can't defend anything. Rather than trying to defend everything, which you can't, you need to cut back and defend and come up with a sensible defensive plan. And that takes a very, very strong personality to be able to do that, being in charge. And the trouble is, the British leaders down there left, especially after Phillips is lost with Fort C, are all very much consensus leaders. And that is a good thing in peacetime. That is a good thing in peacetime militaries, etc. You need to take your force with you, you need to grow it, you need to train people, you need to foster knowledge, understanding, you need a consensus leader. In wartime, though, you need someone who is not going to be worried about upsetting people, and is not going to try and take their time, is going to make a decision and go, right, we're going to do this. And then is going to push it through. Because the fact that remains throughout history is that the worst decision you can take in war is no decision. If you do the right thing, great. You'll save the most lives. If you do the wrong thing, that's the second most lives will be saved. If you do the third, if you just sit there mulling over and trying to think out and going, well, we could do this or this or this or this infinitely, your positions will get dialed in, the artillery and the enemy aircraft will attack, or the ships will bombard, and you will get destroyed. And your entire force will get annihilated. That's one of the reasons why also you need to try and keep the chain of command as short and sensible as possible. If you've got, this is one of the things that causes trouble in wars, when you have chain of commands that go back further and further from the field, and mean that the people at the front can't take decisions because they have to wait for the people up that really back to be briefed and convinced on ideas. And the trouble is, once you're far enough back from the lines, you don't feel the same sense of urgency. Oh yes, we've got dozens of captains waiting for orders. Yes, what's one more? We'll get to them in turn. We can't do things out of turn. That'd be terrible. You can hear it now. But Singapore, Dunkirk are not the end of the gunboat story. In fact, they're definitely not even the end of the Dutch gunboat story. There's a lot of fun going on with the Dutch. And there's a noise outside my door, which could be a big fluffy research assistant, so I'm going to just see if this is him. In fact, gunboats go on throughout World War II to have various roles come up. In fact, you can almost say the gunboat policy expands, because it turns out you need, for all vessels of all sorts of levels, you need that firepower. It comes back to a sort of form of the gunboat which is almost similar to that of the Tribal Class Destroyer, because the Tribal Class Destroyer was of course built and designed with the idea of using their guns, their firepower, to beat off enemy destroyers and light craft and deluge enemy warships, to allow the Royal Navy's more Conventionally, torpedo-orientated destroyers do get close and launch their torpedoes. Will get as close as possible to launch their torpedoes. There's also, of course, the fact they use them for night fighting, where they would fix them by fire. You know, basically illuminate the enemy position by launching enough 4.7-inch shells at it that they will be burning on the deck or set things alight, which will allow us to definitely fire our torpedoes at the enemy. It's a rather, how do I put this, nasty methodology, but if we consider William Fisher and Reginald Henderson, who are the two who seem to be pushing it and coming up with the ideas for this use, neither of them is is known for being a particularly how do I put this, a gentlemanly warfare aspirant, in that both have this idea that you do diplomacy and are friendly and polite and respectful when it's peacetime, but the moment it's war, you do what's necessary to win. No more, no less. And they seem to ascribe that to a lot of the night fighting technique. Get close. Get really close. William Fisher has this approach which he teaches Cunningham, which I was reminded the other day in a conversation with Dragonfly, actually. So I will give him that. I always give credit where credit's due, because I was reminded by Dragonfly of this, that the position and the aim was to spot the enemy at night and get as close as possible. And what you do is you focus your guns on the enemy as you're getting closer and closer and closer, and you only fire when they twitch their guns. When they start to twitch, that's when you fire. That's a very, very interesting technique to use. Combine that with long-range torpedo attacks and aircraft attacks at night, which are supposed to cause the enemy trouble and distract them, and you suddenly have the makings for quite a nasty system. In that, if you think about this, if you get torpedo attacked at night, especially pre-radar, when there aren't night fighters around or anything like that, especially in any navy really, in sort of 1939, 1940. The British are the closest, because the British have all their pilots are night flying trained. The night fighter doctrine is terrible, but the British are the closest because their pilots are actually trained to fly at night and land and take off from their carriers at night. That's just something the British have been insisting on night capability the entire time. But the point is, you get close. If they come in, they drop their torpedoes, let's say they damage a few ships, they don't even sink them, they damage them. Okay, now you've got all the business going over of trying to fix and support the ships, of maybe destroyers going alongside to help with firefighting, recovering people, and or anything going on. And if you then use that cover of that activity to get close in the dark, and they don't realise there are battleships and destroyers and cruisers keeping up closer and closer and closer until they notice them, and then they go for their guns, at which point you're at 7,000, 8,000 yards. Ouch. They're already dialed in. Your guns are already onto it. They're trying to move their guns and start firing them. The shells are already on their way, and you're loading and firing the second salvo and probably the third salvo. That's going to be a lot of firepower hitting them very quickly. Now, this actually comes into play because gunboats, as they become the tool which allow torpedo boats to get close. And how does it work? Well, the British start thinking about their interwar plans for night fighting, and they work on it. So what happens is this, and you can see this in this attack, it's illustrated. The torpedo boats are coming from one side, from inshore in this case, I think. The gunboats are coming from offshore. And the gunboats are coming in from offshore at speed. And they wait until the enemy notices them. When the enemy notices them, they start firing. And then the enemy starts firing back at them. And what does the enemy firing at them reveal? It reveals the enemy's positions. And it tells you better who's who than anything else they can do. And that's when the torpedo boats, which are also getting close, open up with torpedoes. It's simple, and I find the simplicity effective. It's brutally effective. It is. It's one of the things about history, again, is the amount of times people, even historians, will look for complicated answers and solutions to questions they're asking, when actually sometimes it's simplicity. And in this one, when I've been discussing this with people, they've gone, well, yes, the British were ascribing a lot of thought, but we don't know how they developed this so quickly. And, well, in this scenario, I remember talking with a far older historian and a far more well-informed historian probably than I will ever be. Really? And the sort of historian who's forgotten more and had the advantage of knowing quite a lot of people who are involved in these sort of things and specialises in small ships. And his exact words were, they were just using their interwar destroyer doctrine and adapted it to small boats. And I went, that fits. And yet still there were people who were even in that discussion who were going, no, they must have developed it from scratch. And you sit there and go, why do you expect someone to develop something from scratch when they already have a template that works? What is it about you that's attracted to the idea that they must develop these things from thin air coming up there? I know it's a great attraction. It's kind of like the great man fear of history. There are times and periods and occasionally a few great men who really are great men, and a few great women actually as well, if you look at them, who have a massive outside impact on their era. But, as a rule, it's usually them building upon the work of others and others and others, and it's just there the tipping point where it goes. So it's not one person alone. And it's the same with this. Why do you look for whole new development of doctrine and tactics when they already had a doctrine and tactics? And, by the way, doctrine and tactics which were used during World War II. There's a battle called Cape Bon where they absolutely do exactly the doctrine. And it works really well. And there are 2 Italian light cruisers which get massacred because of it. Mainly because they also had fuel on it. Fuel on their thing. Fuel on their they were carrying. Cruel word to use, massacre, but honestly, yeah, they don't have a chance. Either of them, they just don't have a chance. They are caught by 4 destroyers, and they don't have a chance. By the time the fighting takes place, the die was already cast. Because of the scenario and everything that had been set up and the fact that it just played straight into the British doctrine. However, there are other Dutch boats which get involved, and for this point I am going to turn, in the case of the Soamba, to a comment. I've already mentioned this comment. This was from Marcus Fransonium. Now this is a very interesting comment and a very good comment, but it includes something which I thought was really rather cool. And this was a comment. This was a sort of thing from the Soamba docket, which was about how, well, the Dutch had some issues, and the Dutch were having issues with their guns, and well, the Director of Operations Division, Foreign, needed her to get her guns replaced before D-Day because they needed her to provide fire support. To do so, he had to get the various parts of the British government and the Navy online for it. So, HNMS Soamba, defective 5.9-inch gun. A report has come in from the Soamba that their salvos go off like a rumba. 2 guns, they sound fine, but the third 5.9, he bust and refused to go boomba. So, This is sent to the Director of Plans and the DGD and the DDOM for refer for information. The Director of Plans responds, that is R.K. Dixon, "This is very grave news from the Swamba, whose guns are all needed to go boomba. On a fast-nearing day, though we cannot say when exactly, will rise the balloomba." Then there's Director of Plans, Q. "Best plans, where childlike learning sits, remote from the worldly cares, and leaves to skilled division its admiralty affairs, with apologies to Oriel College." Then there's the Gunnery and Anti-Aircraft Warfare, VC Beg. "These airsats made guns of the Sumbas. DGD has said in times without numbers. If ops want nice pops, and the Huns, then these guns must be changed from some British-made bombers." Then John Cowie, Director of Operations Division, Mining. "It is agreed in every quarter that to get results you order, make the bomber underwater. As gun bombers aren't my line, I suggest she tries a mine." And then G.A. Bassett, for Director of Dockyards. "Define any yard for the Sumba. We've searched from the Clyde to the Humber. But we haven't got room for Van Tromp's ruddy brum, much less for this useless old lumber." Return to DOD Foreign with the compliments of the Emergency Despair section, aka the repair team. Then Olivia Bever, Director of Naval Ordnance, responded, "This dreadful affair of the Sumba is really too hard for a plumber. Refer with a laugh straight back to the staff for the personal care of Elumba." Evans Loam, the Director of Gunnery and Anti-Aircraft Warfare. "I hasten to say, in no uncertain way, that my personal cares are as few as my hairs. With some satisfaction, I note proposed action, and pass for notation with gratification." A.B. Cunningham, First Sea Lord. "Sumba has awakened the staff from repose. I'm amazed, all the same, that they do not propose to allocate Sumba, with modification, some velvet chairs, the one stipulation, to the overlord plan for accommodation. Though some of the minutes are just on the verge, I no regret no proposals emerge. I can only assume that the staff and the Sumba have returned with relief to their usual slumber." Then Sifrit, who's the Vice Chief of Naval Staff at this time, "To the foregoing notes on the Sumba, which implies she is now a black number. You must pay no regard, for she's got to bombard, as is very well known to Elumba." And then Van Holtz, the Dutch Naval Liaison Defence Officer in the defence of HMS Sumba. "After so much back chat, it is but right that Sumba should join in this fight. But she loves very much to be rude to and in Dutch, so no one can read it to serve you right. Waarom wordt not nog niet begonnen met verschillen der kanonnen? Rimbels maken help get ze, want met pen, inkt en paper. Word gun ulung ut gewonnen." The translation, temporarily interpreted into Double Dutch by the DODF, unpaid. Please note, they did say the translation wasn't paid for. "Oh, why have you not yet begun the exchange of the above-mentioned gun? How can rhymes help you when no ink, paper, or pen have ever a bully war won?" She did get her guns and she did get to go Bumba. Although it didn't quite end all there. But, you know, it was life. It was felt Dutch morale, she had to be there. Like your morale, the biscuit has to be in there. Yes. Alright. Please, whatever you do not tell your mother that I am quite so generous with these. She will tell me off for your waistline. Although you are a very skinny dog, so no one can ever really tell me off for your waistline. Now, the thing is, the Dutch had quite a history of producing these vessels. And then you had the Maurits van Nassau, which had actually taken part in the defence of the Netherlands. And when I say defence of the Netherlands, she was stationed on the searching guard vessel at Vissingen, and where she was targeted by German aircraft, of which she shot down one. She remained in that area for a couple of days and then ordered to bombard the Dutch aerodrome at Walhoven in Rotterdam, which had been occupied by German paratroopers. She arrived in Hook of Holland, but after loss of destroyer Van Galen during her attempt to do the same, the operation, of which Flores was also a part, Flores being the sister of Somber, was cancelled. As part of the Battle of Auschwitz, Johan Maurits van Nassau was ordered by Den Helder on 12th of May 1940 to silence a German battery near Auschwitz. And on the 14th of May, she bombarded the German battery, consisting of 88mm guns of the 1st Cavalry Division, at a range of about 18 kilometres, and silenced them. Her fire control system enabled great accuracy. Despite fierce retaliation by German aircraft, she remained undamaged, to the great surprise of all. The realisation that the war was coming to an end, and the independent role of the Dutch Navy was over. There was a general evacuation of personnel ships, and Johan Maurits van Nassau left Den Helder on the 14th of May. With the mine layers, HMS Jan van Brakel, De Urks, and Nautilus, and torpedo boats G13 and G15. About 16 kilometres west of Kalenstung, in the afternoon, they were attacked by German aircraft. Johan Maurits van Nassau, which was the largest vessel in the convoy, was the main target. She received 2 or 3 hits, one of which caused a fire near an ammunition stack. The crew were ordered to abandon ship, and 17 crewmen were killed. Later, most crew members were transported back to Den Helder by the rescue ship Doris Riches, but some continued to England aboard the remaining ships. Now, she was one of the biggest and best of their gunboats, armed with 3 150mm guns, 2 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 4 .5-inch machine guns, and 3 .303 machine guns. She actually had deck armour, 25mm, conning tower had 25mm of armour, and the turrets had 25 to 40mm, and she carried a float plane. So, yeah, there are gunboats, and then there are gunboats. Then there are the steam gunboats. Ay, caramba. This is the Royal Navy really trying to produce something which can take out the U-boat. The Schnellboat, as it's properly termed. And basically they start off with 2 methods. They start off with a program which I'll talk about next, and they start off with the steam gunboats. Now, originally they are not given their names grey, and which is why SGB-7 it doesn't have a number. They planned 52. 2 were cancelled. In fact, that no one thought they were going to be worth anything, but we'll leave that to one side. The actual phrase is not worth completing after they've been damaged, usually used, but the fact is there is an argument that if the Royal Navy had really thought they were going to be useful at that point, they'd have still completed them because they could have done. They just didn't think they were going to be useful, so they preferred to reuse the resources for other things. Completed 7, and 1 is lost. That's SGB-7. They are fast, to an extent, in that capable of 35 knots, although when they have sort of armament and armour upgrades, they do lose some of their speed. And of course, for a while, Grey Goose became one of the fastest vessels in the world, because after World War II, she has her engines replaced with by Vospers, with a pair of experimental Rolls-Royce RM60 gas turbines. I haven't finished yet. These turbines featured intercooled compressors and recuperators in order to boost turbine power output and reduce fuel consumption. This gas turbine provided 35% more power, so that took up her power level to roughly 11,000 Yeah. 11,000 shaft horsepower, which is nice. They weighed 50% less, so it took tons off her weight and took up 25% less space compared to the original steam machinery, which has another effect on ship's weight and displacement. Now, this power plant proved successful and she produced incredibly fast, but it was too complex and the supporting technology too immature for wider service at the time, sadly enough. It's so sad. It just is. It's sad. Now, I would recommend George L. Moore's The Steam Gunboats. It's a chapter in Warship 1999, and it's really worth a read. I would also recommend Robert A. Harmon's Marine Gas Turbines: A New Generation, published in Mechanical Engineering CIME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, if you can get a copy. I did through JSTOR. Both of those are good sources. Really good sources to go and have a look at. And Samuel Ernest Ellicott produced The Story of Ships, which was also a fairly good starting point, but that was published in 1958 and is rather on the nose. They were capable vessels, but their main problem was they were so big in relation to what they were hunting. They were often silhouetted more than the vessels they were hunting, which is a problem, because that allows the vessels to really spot on them. Which is where the Fairmile chain come in, and for these, you have this book, Allied Coastal Force of World War II. There are multiple volumes of this. This is Volume 1, which is Fairmile Designs and US Submarine Chasers. There is Volume 2, and there are others around as well. And then there's Dogboats of War, which is coming from the next one. Now, the Fairmile C is basically, right then, we have a plan to build a better, bigger, better one, which is based off the Fairmile B, but we're still producing the Fairmile B, and we haven't yet got the jigs and things ready for the wood to form the wooden hull for the next vessel. But we need gunboats. However, we have the jigs available for the Fairmile A. So let's build a gunboat based on the Fairmile A, and that is the Fairmile C. They build 24. 5 are lost to enemy action. They were involved in all sorts of cool operations, including, of course, the raid on St. Nazaire, Operation Chariot, where MGB 314 took part. And 2 of these vessels well, 3 survived till 2002, 2 survived till 2018, and there is apparently 1 at Hailing Island which is still around. Which is good to know, and I hope it's in good condition, and I hope it's being looked after, but I haven't got many more details about it. So I don't know how well it's surviving. The Fairmile Cs were involved in a lot of close escort work. That's what they seem to have specialised in, and clandestine operations, and they were very good for both operations and both sets. Sorry, I'm patting the dog, and because my foot is resting on the table, it is shaking the camera. This is why, as soon as my stabilised camera gets here, it can't be too soon. It cannot be too soon. And I've been talking a lot today, so voice is starting to go. They had 2 officers and 14 crew. They had a top speed of 26.5 knots. And they had a range of 500 nautical miles at 12 knots. Now, this means they're not exactly that fast, but with 350 horsepower supercharged half-Scots petrol engines and a displacement of 72 tons, they're more than good enough for their job, weren't they? Yes, they were. And their job was a close escort of convoys. So again, The success of a gunboat, especially once you get into World War II, it depends on its ability to conduct its actual job, the job it's built for. These were quite successful because they were built for clandestine operations, they were built for the immediate needs, clandestine operations and escorts. And they could do that because, well, they were designed to be armed with a quick-firing 2-pounder, that's a 40mm gun. Sometimes they'd have a couple of them. And 4 50 cal machine gun, well, .50 cal Vickers machine guns, and 4 .303s. Later on, they had 2 2-pounders, usually of the same type, roughly, and up to 4 20mm autocon cannon, usually in 2 twin, and up to 2 single Oriclon cannon, and 4 depth charges. You can never carry enough 20mm. You can never carry enough 20mm. And then we have the Fairmaldi, the dogboats. And I will add, for this, all these classes, etc., this book is... Make sure I'm open at the dogboat section. This book is great. It has all the designs, all the drawings, and a lot of the information in them. And a lot of pictures. The Fairmaldi dogboats. The Royal Navy trying to build a combined vessel that could do both the work of a torpedo boat and the work of a gunboat, so it could be used for either roles. And turned out it was also used for motor anti-submarine warfare boat, long-range recovery craft to pick up downed airmen, and post-war a fast patrol boat. They could be very easily adapted, and you can see that because the one up the top has scallops taken out of it to allow for its torpedoes to launch. The one at the bottom doesn't have the scallops missing. So, the one at the top, torpedo boat, theoretically. The one at the bottom, gunboat, theoretically. But often, you would have their weapons swapped around. So sometimes those scallops do not tell you what you need to know. Those scallops might mean it's carrying a torpedoes. It might not. It might have just had the scallops, but they might be fitted out as a gunboat at this point. Now, their top speed was 29 knots. But they were usually able to actually get to 30 knots. 29 knots at full load, but very quickly they could get to 30 knots. And most of the earlier torpedo boats, etc., could do 40 knots. Why is Britain prepared to accept the drop in speed? Because of the various advantages this gave you in stability. What was found was that this had a slower overall top speed, but it retained its speed better. This gave it an advantage often even against Schnell boats, which was theoretically faster than it, but they fastened it in calm seas. Once it gets really, really rough, it tended to be that the Fairmaldi could actually catch them. And besides, the Fairmaldis became pretty much, how do I put this politely, ambush predators as far as Schnell boats were concerned. Now, they're armed with a 57mm gun, as you can see, which started out as a manual loader, but eventually had the Mollins autoloader fitted to it. And I'm trying to move my notes around the poodle, so if I look weird, I do apologise. They tended to be armed with 2 single 6-pounder guns, 4 20mm Oricons in 2 single and a twin, 2 twin .303 Vickers K guns, 4 depth charges, and yeah, well. That's usually sort of the later end of war sort of gunboat armament. As a torpedo boat, their armament will be different. Ugh. You're gonna let me read from my book now? Okay. You decided I needed to. I'm getting too comfortable doing this. I needed to do it with a certain level of limitation, right? You're giving me, making me better at my job. You're cute. Very cool pictures in this book. I will try not to be distracted while I find the section I am looking for, which I had to close quickly because otherwise someone's paws were going to crush my fingers in there. Can't think who that would be. You're innocent, aren't you? Completely innocent. Now, they didn't stop with a Fairmile D, they actually produced more. And they produced the Fairmile F at various points, and the H and the I think. H-type, definitely. I-type is more disputed. I remember an I, but it's not in this book. But I remember... maybe it was just a test bed. Could have been a test bed. I was reading about, but it's another book. Gunboats were pretty darn successful, and actually they were the vessels which were carrying out this attack. Again, it's making up to an extent for speed disadvantage, but in that not as fast as they could be, but they are very capable of doing a very nasty attack. And as protection vessels, they did prove very, very capable. But, and this is my big glutamus maximus of this whole scenario, dogboats, Fairmile Ds, sloops, gunboats of the Dragonfly class, you can build as many as you like in peacetime. You could have built as many as you liked in peacetime. Let me just clarify for you what Article 8 of the Washington Treaty says. Well, Article 8 of the Washington Treaty says the replacement of aircraft carriers should be effected only as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 3, provided, however, that all aircraft carrier tonnage in existence or building on November 12, 1921 should be considered experimental and may be replaced within a total tonnage limit prescribed in Article 7 without regard to its age. I meant the London Naval Treaty. Luckily, I also have that up, yeah. I picked my wrong notes tab, didn't I? So, this is why I shouldn't have PDF notes, because they're just tabs. Article 8. Subject to any special agreements which may submit them to limitation, the following vessels are exempt from limitation. Naval service for combat vessels of 600 tons, that's 610 metric tons, standard displacement and under, no limitation. Naval service combatants exceeding 600 tons, that's 610 metric tons, but not exceeding 2,000 tons, that's 2,032 metric tons, standard displacement, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun above 6.1 inches in caliber, that's 155 millimeters. Mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches, 76 millimeter caliber. So you could put 2 twin 4-inch guns on a sloop. You could fit it with two twin 4-inch guns. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes. Okay. Are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. It's not designed for a speed of 20 knots because I fitted a governor to its turbine, so it can't do more than 20 knots, so we get the range out of it. Moment more happens. Screwdriver! Governor's off! Yeah, what speed can we do now? 26 knots and rising. Very good. No, seriously. You can't get past it that easy. Oh, we only have one boiler. That's just a water heater. Oh, that's just our indoor closed drying space. That's not space for another boiler to be fitted. No. There's no... You might see piping and everything there, but no, we can't just cut out the top and drop in another boiler. We can't. We honestly can't. You can't do that. C. Naval service vessels not specifically built as fighting ships, which are employed on fleet duties or as troop transports or in some way, an other way than as fighting ships, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun above 6.1 inches caliber. Mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches caliber. are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots, are protected by armour plate, are designed or fitted to launch mines, are fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. So the first two groups can be fitted with armour plate, can be fitted to receive, well, you don't want, not really receive aircraft from the air, because 2,000 tons, that's going to be interesting. Can be designed and fitted to launch mines. So again, your sloops, mine layers. Again, another use of them. So anti-submarine warfare, gunboat, convoy escort with their guns and anti-air defense, and mine layer. Those are 4 pretty crucial roles for small vessels, and you can build as many as you like. Yes, the Fairmiles are wooden vessels, but Britain has years of experience of looking after wooden vessels to call back on. You could have built these up and they never needed to have entered the water. They could have been built and sitting inside a covered factory somewhere, or one of the other various spaces you have around the UK which could have been used. You could have built them and stockpiled vessels for if war came. You didn't even have to use them. Just have enough that you can have a few crews, reservist crews, train them. Oh yeah, we'll build something in wartime. Yeah, we have a few dozen more sitting in a shed. And again, they're actually within the treaty agreement. You can build as many as you like, so it doesn't even have to be secret. It can just be, oh yeah, we don't use them. We just had them saved for a wartime. You could have had them sitting in Singapore. A few dozen of these. Think about what happened to Scorpion, and imagine if she'd been escorted by a dozen torpedo boats. Hello, Mr. Cruiser and Destroyers! Suddenly, life becomes very different for the cruiser and the destroyers. Okay. Again, imagine you have those AA sloops, etc., and anti-submarine warfare sloops, and the things they have that sort of build up through the war, or you have these as extra in their anti-submarine form as extra escorts going around protecting Scarpa flow along with those sloops. Again, they don't require many crew. D, from Article 8 again, mount more than one aircraft launching apparatus on the centre line, or 2, one on each broadside. E, if fitted with any means of launching aircraft in the air, are designed or adapted to operate at sea more than 3 aircraft. So you build a 2,000-ton sloop, you can design it to launch, carry up to 3 seaplanes, and it can have the centerline catapult to launch them, or 2, one on each broadside. For 2,000 tons, you can build a pretty darn useful vessel that can be very useful for many operations. And you can build as many as you like without any worry about the treaty limitations. No total tonnage limitations, no total tonnage limitations at all. You can build as many as you like. The fact that nations like Britain weren't, the fact that America wasn't building them, the fact that France wasn't building as many as you like, that Italy or any maritime nation at all signed up to the treaty, Japan especially, were not using this clause to build as many anti-submarine warfare escorts, as many gunboats, whatever, as they liked, to provide them with that pool of escorts, etc., for a major war, is criminal lack of preparation, in my opinion. It's absolutely criminal, and it's part of the gunboat story, because these vessels, they are often pointed out to be these great wartime developments. And yes, there is some peacetime work which goes in them. There are some designs. The Fairmile, etc., and other parts of the Fairmile family are going on before World War II. But the problem is, they should have been being built before World War II. If you consider how quickly the Royal Navy develops from the Fairmile A up to the Fairmile D, there are 12 Fairmile A's. There are 650 Fairmile B's. which are sort of more of a motor launch than anything else. Use of various things. Then there is 24 Fairmile Cs, and then there is 229 Fairmile Ds, which are considered the best of the bunch. Consider how quickly that progresses. In times of war. Imagine how quickly Imagine would have achieved if they'd been building a few each year, just ordering, let's say, a dozen or so each year from Fairmile, from 1930 onwards. And then think, well, that's not going to be a lot, Alex. A dozen a year is not going to be a lot. If you're ordering them from 1930 onwards, you probably get them within the year. So that would mean you would have 108 ready to go. In 1939, that's useful, but also importantly, let's say in 1937 you go, right, then we're going to double them, we're going to get 24 each next 2 years. Okay. That means you have 12 times 12, which is 144. That also means you have production facilities which can produce 24 a year in peacetime. You have all the technicians and all the jigs and all the systems built up to produce, already produced that, already worked up. Now you want to produce those under a wartime load, where people work weekends, where people work 24 hours a day, where you want to build more jigs and train up more people to do it. You suddenly have a far larger base to build from. And these vessels are not expensive. And again, considering some of these vessels, apparently, as I said, there's a Fairmile D, no known survivors, only 2 wrecks, one in Chatham, one in Ellingsway, Norway. Fairmile C, as I said, 1 still surviving, theoretically to this day. And surviving examples of the Fairmile B, well, there's RML 497, which is still around and seems to be doing all sorts of fun things. Refitted in 2009 back to her traditional service, and it has been acquired by the National Museum of the Royal Navy. So yeah, still around. Doesn't seem to me like those wooden hulls break that quickly, does it? Soviet gunboats. Ah, the Soviet gunboats. The Soviet riverine forces are cool. Now, I'm going to focus on 2 types when I'm talking about their gunboats, because they have literally oodles and oodles on them. I'm going to talk about the BKA 1124 class and the BKA 1125 class. Now, these 2 classes of vessels are interesting and have some very interesting developments. They start off being built in 1935. They started off, though, sort of a bit earlier, 1934. But they sort of they're constructed in mass from 1935 onwards. And they come with a range of tank turrets. They have the T-28, the T-35s, and then in 1959 the T-34. Basically, this is the Soviets going, what do we produce a lot of? We produce a lot of tanks, and a lot of tank turrets. Okay. What's the big problem? Well, we have the fact that we have these huge rivers which we have to cross, and which can provide us with a logistics base as long as we can get the stuff up and down them, but also we need to cross them. How do we cross a river? We need firepower and fire support. We need someone to give us fire to give us cover as we cross the river. Neat. Firepower. 60 were in service when the Germans invaded. 150 were built. As time went on, some were equipped with rocket launchers. Katusha rocket launchers. So they now had direct fire with the T-34 turret and indirect fire thanks to the Katusha, because that's what no one wanted to see coming towards them, but it worked and was frigging scary for anyone to try and fight. Well, it gets worse, because they also built the 1125, which was basically take the 1124 and go, I think we can make this nastier. The 1124 was 42 tons in standard and top speed of 28 knots. The 1125 was 29 tons standard and top speed 28 knots. Please note what I'm saying here. 28 knots, 30 knots. There's a certain thing starting to come around about what a decent gunboat speed is going to be. They had armour, though, and, well, the 1124 had a crew of 17, the 1125 had a crew of 10, and they were, 150 of those were produced. 20 were in service in these of the 125s before the German invasion. Others taking entry into service in about entering into service 1942 to 44. They had the T-34-85 gun with the longer range, and they were nasty. They had a lot of success. Armed with a 76mm, 12.7 inch, 12.7 millimeter gun, not 12.7 inch. Heavy machine gun and two 7.62 machine guns plus Katyusha rockets. Yeah, that will make the point. That does make the point. They even had one which was 151 tons when fully loaded. That was the MBK 1943 class. That carried two 76mm guns, a 37mm gun, and four 12.7mm machine guns, and could also be fitted with rockets and other things if they wanted to. These things are just designed to really not be nice for anyone to try and fight you. The Soviets had a great habit of turning up with not only their torpedo boats but also their gunboats when they really wanted to make a point, and they had lots of both sets, and they did help them in fighting in the Baltic and fighting in the Black Sea, and fighting up and down the rivers as well. However, someone who seems to forget the men. Right, so, please note, when you think of America and the American Navy, you will think of usually two things. One, firepower, two, speed. Those have been things which have been constant in American construction for a very, very long time. So, remembering their history of their PT boats, John F. Kennedy sailed for them, and what he fitted his PT boat with, when I started looking at the American gunboats, because I thought, well, I've never read much about them. Okay. I must have really missed out on some cool history. How could I have done this? Was my first thought. And then when I did more research. And this first happened to me a few years ago when I went through this, when I was teaching a class about torpedo boats and small boat tactics in the Pacific. And I was just picking up to teach it for a colleague, and I went, there's very little on American gunboats in this. And he went, yeah, there's very little about them. They don't get into much. I'm like, this must be wrong. Come on, this is America. They are the land of speed, of NASCAR, of all these things which are basically about getting the most power out of any engine physically possible. And also, they are the land and nation you do associate with guns. They love them. Other people might have invented guns first, but when you think of guns, you think of America. Usually they have many, and they are large. So, there was my mind thinking that surely the gunboat was the match made in absolute heaven for the US Navy. Surely what they had to do was actually restrain designers going absolutely insane with them. No. The Bureau of Ships in the 1930s and 40s lives to prove me wrong. So, they go around looking for a vessel which is suitable. And they decide they're going to use the S-497 class submarine chasers. Now here is the small problem with the submarine chasers. They are designed to be escorts for convoys. They're designed to be patrol boats. They're designed with a top speed of 21 knots. That's if they have the 1,540 horsepower General Motors engine and two-stroke diesel engines fitted. The PG-1M1s, well, they were supposed to provide support to PT boats in the Pacific. They are supposed to provide the same style of combat support which the Americans saw dog boats getting up to in World War II. This book by Leonard Reynolds is a good example of what the British dog boats and Norwegian dog boats especially get up to in World War II. That's what the FMLDs are nicknamed. The trouble is, the PT boats, they're quick. They're really quick. They can do 40 plus knots quick. And this isn't going to work. The PT, okay, yes, you could talk about their cruising. Perhaps they're providing the cover for their cruising range. But they're armed with a 3-inch dual-purpose gun, a 40mm gun, 4 twin .5-inch machine guns, and a 60mm mortar. Okay, that's a gunboat armament. That's a traditional gunboat armament. And you start to realise what might have happened. I think what happened was this. The Bureau of Ships heard the phrase gunboat, and they thought back to their beautifully designed, wonderfully operated Yangtze vessels, like this one. They thought back to them and thought, oh, we're building something like this again. Not thinking, no, you are building something like this. Again, you can have a speed differential, but the trouble is, if you consider an attack pattern, let's say this is providing cover for the torpedo boats. They approach. They have to keep at 21 knots for quite a considerable time until they get within gun range, because that's the maximum speed this can do, and if they get ahead of it, then it can't provide them any support. And then they can accelerate up to 50 knots, 40, 50 knots, launch their torpedo attacks, and then now they're trying to get out of the area as quick as they can, because the one thing torpedo boats don't want to do, they don't want to hang around while the enemy gets their act together. They want to shoot their torpedoes and get away. But then they have to slow down to 21 knots again to leave. That's not going to work. The same happens with the PGM-9s, which are actually even slower. I mean, they're 20.2 knots in range and speed. They displace 450 tons to the previous vessel, to the PGM-1's 95 tons, and they actually have two 1,440 brake horsepower engines. So, please note that brake horsepower for both. They actually have 200 less horsepower, and they weigh 4.5 times as much. Armed with a 3-inch 50 dual-purpose gun, a twin 40mm gun, 6 20s, 2 50 cal machine guns, and a rocket launcher. They end up being used for supporting minesweepers and protecting minesweepers, which is a good use for them, but it's also probably why the PT boats get such a reputation for adaptation and adding, finding and putting on guns, etc., because frankly they have no fire support. They have no fire support. We are now approaching the 2-hour mark, so if anyone's still watching this, hello, thank you, I hope you're enjoying. It's nice to know that some of you are still here. We're just getting to the summary. So, in peacetime, gunboats are the equivalent of modern day helicopters. They are, and as I said, tanks, APCs, the lot. They are a way of projecting power inshore, often inland, thanks to rivers and other channels. In wartime, they provide fire support for amphibious operations, for torpedo boats, for mine laying and minesweeping. They provide for a myriad of small but necessary functions that are very easy to overlook, but very difficult to do without. And the fact that all these small vessels are always neglected in peacetime disturbs me on many levels. And what's worse is I know the argument that navies would make. It's that the trouble is, if we order them into peacetime, the treasuries just think a warship's a warship's a warship, and they see one warship costing this much and one warship costing that much, and they presume that they can both do the same job, so they basically force us to cancel the more expensive one. And the trouble is, the expensive one takes a lot longer to build, and we need the expensive one really. We need the expensive one as much on a sort of individual unit level, whereas we need the others in aggregate, and we won't get enough of the others to be for the aggregate in peacetime. And that's the big problem. It's to persuade governments that you need to do these things in peacetime. And that's the problem for gunboats, because they are incredibly useful. They're incredibly useful, and I would argue modern OPVs are probably their successors. But, as I said, OPVs are sort of a successor between a sloop and a sloop's gunboat form, really. Considering they can't do minesweeping, mine laying, or all the anti-submarine warfare as a rule. So, they're there. But again, try and get enough of them out of a government, and you'll be in a hiding to nothing. Oh yeah, question. If you wanted to build a small boat force as a navy, how would you hide it? The Royal Navy comes up with this wishing wheeze of calling them motor launches, and that's how they get the fair Malays, and a lot of them. But, and to an extent the female bees as well, so the female bees especially. But how would you do it? How would you go about getting small boats and sloops if you were a navy in the 1920s and 30s and actually getting them built? Dutch do quite a good job. It's always worth a look at them. And what have we got coming up? We have the Where Are the Dalmatians, and we know now where this lovely Belfast came from that we'll be enjoying and building on Sunday, because it came from Glyn. So thank you, Glyn. It was very nice of you to send me a present, and that was for helping out when he came to the UK, and that was very nice. But thank you very much, and we'll be building it on Sunday or tomorrow. Well, coming next week, we've got designing ships, still judging by eye, as Long Patrol. I think you're going to enjoy that one, because I'm going to get into as much of ship design as I can, while giving basically a historian's introduction to ship design, rather than a ship designer's introduction to ship design. So I do expect to have naval architects going, no, 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 we do it this way, that way. Yes, I'm giving an overview, not the finite details. If you want the finite details, there are some brilliant people on Twitter, and etc. to go and follow, who will give you the finite details. I'm giving people who don't do ship design a historical overview of ship design. Hope you enjoy. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.